Hello, Recapped Mr. here. Today, I'm going to explain a comedy short film called Alternative Math. Watch out and take care. In today's America, everything you say must agree with everyone else. Mrs. Wells, a maths teacher in an elementary school, welcomes a pupil named Danny to her class. Danny has recently failed a maths test and is furious about it. He isn't upset because he didn't perform well on the test, rather, he is troubled by the teacher who gave him low ratings and declared all of his answers were incorrect. Danny presents Mrs. Wells his answer sheet, which is scribbled in red and has a huge F on top. The teacher examines his work calmly and informs him that his answers are incorrect. Given that the child wrote 2 + 2 = 22, it is apparent that he is struggling with addition. Mrs. Wells, being the kind teacher that she is, urges the youngster not to be sad because it is usual for children his age to be puzzled by numbers. She emphasizes that he is here to learn and that making errors is part of the process. But, judging by Danny's expression, her good words passed him by. He gives his teacher a snarky "nua" to convey his misunderstanding. Mrs. Wells maintains her composure and encourages him to reconsider the questions. She points out his obvious error, but Danny appears unconcerned. Mrs. Wells goes on to explain that 2 + 2 does not equal 22 since addition does not mean simply putting the numbers next to each other, you must add them. The boy scoffs and calls her method foolish as she explains how he can add the numbers. The mom manages to keep her rage at bay and tries to set a good example for him. She takes 2 markers in each hand and holds them together, asking the child how many markers she has in total. Danny responds with all the sass he can muster that the answer is 22. Mrs. Wells eventually becomes annoyed and informs him that he is incorrect and that the obvious answer is 4. The spoiled brat slams the box of markers off the desk and storms out of the classroom. Mrs. Wells is rendered speechless by the children's behavior, yet she seems unconcerned, until his parents show up in her classroom the next day with a complaint. They introduce themselves nicely at first and take a seat at Mrs. Wells' request. Before the parents can express their concerns, the teacher tells them that they have nothing to be concerned about. She goes on to say that it is totally normal for youngsters like Danny to become irritated when they are struggling with a subject, especially one where they cannot use their imagination. Mrs. Wells' good comments do not appear to be appreciated by Danny's mother. She ignores what the teacher says and wonders why Danny got some of her so-called exam answers wrong. Mrs. Wells is taken aback by the roughness, but she doesn't show it. She gathers herself and begins to describe the types of questions on the test. The group falls silent after she says Danny's answer to the question, "What is 2 + 2?" was 22. One would think that the parents realized it was their son's fault, but to Mrs. Wells' astonishment, they ask her to continue, waiting for her to prove her point. The pair clearly does not comprehend that the child's response is incorrect. The teacher states unequivocally that 22 is not the correct answer. In disbelief, the mother approaches Mrs. Wells, who informs her that the response is incorrect. Mrs. Wells responds that is how mathematics works. The pair completely misses the message and accuses Mrs. Wells of calling their son stupid. The teacher clarifies that it was not her aim and that she is merely attempting to remedy his error. When the father begins to rant, things become hot. He asks Mrs. Wells who she is to say his son's response is incorrect and hers is correct. Mrs. Wells is completely taken aback by the couple's folly. She tries to persuade them that the answers are correct and will never alter. The mother pretends to understand Mrs. Wells' words before accusing her of being a Nazi and putting absolute answers on her child. The teacher, perplexed by everything, boldly asks the two whether they know what 2 + 2 equals. Instead of an answer, Mrs. Wells receives abuse. The father mocks her accent before calling her a smart-ass tramp. Their kindness from earlier fades into thin air as they become more hostile. Mrs. Wells, still polite, informs them that she is unable to continue the conversation and leads them the exit. Danny's mother declares that they will protest to the principal, but his father declares that his son is a free thinker for stating that the answer is 22. Before leaving, the mother threatens to have her fired and calls her a BTCH. Mrs. Wells, having had enough of the two, sarcastically shames them for not knowing what 2 + 2 is. The action abruptly ends as Mrs. Wells' mother slaps her across the face. The following day, The principal visits Mrs. Wells' class to discuss the situation. He gets right to the subject and asks her what the problem was with Danny's parents. Mrs. Wells declares that things became a little weird since the parents refused to cooperate. When she inquires about how management is addressing the problem, she discovers that they want her to apologize to the parents. This irritates her even more because it was her mother who beat her. Mrs. Wells telling the students that their solution is incorrect bothers the principal. Mrs. Wells, perplexed, claims that it is her role as a teacher to correct them when they make mistakes. However, the principal is not of the same mind. He says that professors should not impose their biased views on students because students have their own perspectives. Everything in the new and modernized world must be politically correct. It is incorrect to call a child's answer incorrect based on your personal opinion. Mrs. Wells is taken aback, claiming that maths cannot be biased because it is factual. The principal becomes irritated and claims that Mrs. Wells' attitude is exacerbating the matter. He scornfully tells her that she is not respecting the children, which is against their school's standards. On that day, a mass of parents gathers in front of the school to oppose the instructor's absolute behavior. Mrs. Wells is shoved by the audience, which demands that she quit undermining their children's confidence. Some even demand that she apologize to the parents she upset by saying that 2 + 2 = 4. The situation worsens when they accuse her of hating children in general. As the problem becomes more serious, the school's superintendent and his council meet with Mrs. Wells. She cautiously requests that the Board of Men wait a week or two for the situation to blow over. However, the superintendent maintains that they are unable to wait since the parents are suing the school for emotional distress to a kid. Mrs. Wells cries that she merely said 2 + 2 = 4, which should not have generated such a stir. The board members scoff at her remark and respond that she should acknowledge the possibility of numerous valid solutions to the same question. Mrs. Wells is completely taken aback. She knows she is correct, but the world appears to have altered into a strange realm where every answer must be true and every fact is contested. The principal accuses her of presenting all those who disagree with her as idiots. When Mrs. Wells maintains her position, the board suspends her and asks her to reconsider her extremist views if she ever wants to return to her work. Mrs. Wells packs her belongings from school and returns home the next day. She watches TV at night and discovers that the scandal has become national news. Many politicians are disputing whether 2 + 2 = 22 or 4. The media exaggerates the story, labeling Mrs. Wells as an activist who was caught violating a child's First Amendment rights. She has been labeled a liberal elitist for claiming that the definite answer to the simple question is 4. Some even mock Mrs. Wells for not keeping her kids in her class for more than a year, to which Mrs. Wells responds angrily, "It's called graduating." She receives a call from the school when she is watching the news. Irritated by the idiocy of the reporters, the principal informs her that she has been fired formally. He also invites her to visit the school the next day and asks that she refrain from radicalizing the youngsters. Mrs. Wells attends her final day of school the next day. As she enters through the door, she is hailed by a group of reporters who have been waiting for her. The school has encouraged them to demonstrate that they do not support Mrs. Wells' radical views and that she is no longer an employee. Before officially signing the papers and terminating her contract with the school, the principal promises to pay her the last 2 terms' wages. The compensation rounds up to $2,000 for the previous month and $2,000 for this month. The principal says it's $4,000 altogether, but Mrs. Wells scoffs and says it's actually $22,000. The film finishes with the principal looking nervously at the reporters and then back at a smiling Mrs. Wells. Please subscribe to assist the channel, turn on notification and leave a like. Thank you for taking the time to watch. See you again soon.